In the vast expanse of the universe, where stars burned like ancient lanterns and planets drifted in silent orbits, there existed a realm known only to a select few, a place where legends whispered of an alien queen whose power was as boundless as her sorrow. Her name was never spoken aloud by those who served her, for fear that even uttering it might summon her wrath. She ruled over a sprawling empire of crystalline cities suspended in the void, their spires glittering with light from distant suns. The queen herself was a being of extraordinary beauty and terrifying majesty, her form towering yet elegant, adorned with shimmering scales that shifted colors like liquid rainbows under the glow of her throne room's bioluminescent ceiling. Her dominion stretched across galaxies, her influence reaching into every corner of space where life dared to take root. Entire species bowed before her will, offering tribute not out of loyalty but out of sheer survival instinct. For the queen was not merely a ruler, she was a force of nature, capable of freezing entire armies with a single glance or reducing planets to barren wastelands with a flick of her clawed hand. Yet, despite her immense power, there was something haunting about her presence, an air of melancholy that clung to her like shadows, visible even to those too afraid to look directly at her. It was said that centuries ago, long before her reign became legend, the queen had once known love. A bond so profound that it had softened her edges and filled the cold halls of her palace with warmth. But that love had been torn away from her in the cruelest of ways, leaving behind a wound that time could not heal. Her husband, a warrior of unparalleled skill and devotion, had perished in battle, not against enemies of flesh and blood, but against forces beyond comprehension. Some claimed he had sacrificed himself to save her, while others whispered darker tales of betrayal and loss. Whatever the truth, his absence had transformed her, hardening her heart and fueling her ambition until nothing remained but the iron will to conquer all who stood in her path. Now, centuries later, the queen sat upon her throne, surrounded by advisors and envoys who trembled in her presence. They spoke of new conquests, of rebellious worlds that needed subjugation, of resources to be harvested and civilizations to be brought to heel. But none dared mention the past, not the war that had claimed her beloved, nor the grief that still lingered in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. To do so would be to invite disaster, for though she ruled with unyielding strength, there were moments when her gaze would drift, unfocused, as if searching for something, or someone, long lost. And so, the empire grew, expanding outward like ripples on a cosmic pond. Worlds fell under her control, their inhabitants bending to her decrees without question. Yet, beneath the surface of this seemingly invincible rule lay a vulnerability few could see, a queen haunted by memories of what once was, clinging to power as if it might somehow fill the void left by her husband's death. It was this fragility, hidden beneath layers of steel and fire, that made her both feared and pitied by those who served her. And it was this fragility that would soon lead to a moment no one could have foreseen, a moment when the universe itself seemed to hold its breath. The day began like any other in the queen's vast empire, with a hum of activity echoing through the crystalline corridors of her palace. Servants scurried about, carrying reports and offerings, while guards stood at attention, their armored forms gleaming under the soft luminescence of the walls. Among these guards was a newcomer, recently assigned to the inner sanctum after proving himself in countless battles across the stars. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his armor etched with intricate patterns that marked him as one of the elite warriors of the queen's personal guard. His helmet concealed most of his features, but his posture radiated discipline and strength, qualities that had earned him this prestigious post. As he took his position near the entrance to the throne room, the guard adjusted his stance slightly, ensuring his spear rested perfectly vertical against the polished floor. Around him, the atmosphere buzzed with quiet tension, the kind that always preceded an audience with the queen. No one dared speak above a whisper, and even then, conversations were brief and purposeful. The newcomer paid little mind to the murmurs around him, focusing instead on maintaining his composure. This was his first assignment within the inner sanctum, and he was determined to prove himself worthy of the honor. Inside the throne room, the queen sat motionless, her regal figure framed by the cascading light of the bioluminescent ceiling. Her advisors droned on about matters of state, their voices blending into a monotone hum that barely registered in her consciousness. She listened with half an ear, nodding occasionally to give the impression of attentiveness, though her thoughts wandered far from the mundane details of governance. Something felt different today. A faint unease prickled at the edges of her awareness, though she couldn't pinpoint its source. Perhaps it was the subtle shift in the energy of the room, Or maybe it was simply the weight of another day spent ruling over an empire built on the ashes of her past. Then, without warning, the doors to the throne room creaked open, and the newcomer entered. His steps were measured and deliberate, each movement precise as he approached the dais where the queen sat. The sound of his boots striking the floor echoed softly, drawing the attention of everyone present. Heads turned, whispers ceased, and for a moment, the entire chamber seemed to hold its breath. Even the queen paused, her gaze lifting from the scroll in her hands to study the figure now standing before her. At first glance, there was nothing particularly remarkable about him. Like the others, he wore the standard armor of the royal guard, his helmet obscuring his face. But as he came closer, something about his bearing caught her eye. There was a familiarity in the way he carried himself, a confidence tempered by humility, a strength that didn't need to announce itself. Her brow furrowed ever so slightly, and her fingers tightened imperceptibly around the edge of her throne. The sensation of unease she'd felt earlier intensified, coiling in her chest like a serpent preparing to strike. When the guard finally stopped a respectful distance from the dais, he knelt, lowering his head in a gesture of deference. "Your Majesty," he intoned, his voice deep and steady, resonating with a clarity that cut through the silence of the room. It was then that the queen froze, not because of his words, but because of the timbre of his voice. It wasn't identical, of course. No one could truly replicate the exact cadence of another's speech. But there was enough similarity to send a jolt through her system, sharp and unexpected, like a shard of ice piercing her heart. Her breath hitched audibly, though only those closest to her would have noticed. The advisors exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to continue speaking or wait for some sign from their sovereign. The queen, however, was oblivious to them. Her focus was entirely on the kneeling figure before her, her mind racing as fragments of memory surged unbidden to the surface. The way he held himself, the resonance of his voice. It was as though time itself had folded inward, bringing the ghost of her past into the present. For a fleeting instant, the queen's vision blurred, and the throne room dissolved around her. In its place stood a battlefield bathed in twilight, the air thick with smoke and the cries of the dying. She saw him again, her husband, clad in battered armor, his face streaked with dirt and sweat as he fought alongside her. His laughter rang out amidst the chaos, a sound so full of life that it drowned out the screams of war. And then, just as suddenly, the image shattered, leaving her gasping for air as reality snapped back into focus. No one moved. The guard remained kneeling, unaware of the storm raging within the queen. Slowly, deliberately, she rose from her throne, her movements graceful yet charged with an intensity that silenced even the faintest rustle of fabric. She descended the steps of the dais, her gaze locked onto the figure before her. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though invisible chains weighed down her limbs. When she finally stopped, mere feet away from him, she reached out a trembling hand, hesitating only briefly before removing his helmet. The face revealed beneath was not her husband's, of course. The guard was younger, his features sharper, his eyes a shade darker. Yet the resemblance was undeniable, striking enough to make her stagger backward as if struck. Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, a single tear traced a path down her cheek, catching the light before vanishing into the folds of her gown. The room was utterly still, the collective breath of everyone present suspended in anticipation of what might happen next. But the queen did not speak. She simply stared, her expression unreadable, as the weight of centuries pressed down upon her shoulders. For in that moment, she was no longer the ruler of an empire, but a woman confronted by the specter of a love she had buried long ago. The throne room remained eerily silent, the air thick with tension as the queen stood frozen, her gaze locked onto the young guard whose face bore such an uncanny resemblance to her late husband. Around her, the advisors and attendants exchanged wary glances, their faces pale with apprehension. None dared to move or utter a word, for they could sense that something monumental was unfolding before them. The queen's reaction, her sudden vulnerability, was unprecedented, a crack in the impenetrable facade she had maintained for centuries. It was as though the very foundation of her authority had been shaken, leaving everyone uncertain of what might come next. The guard, meanwhile, remained kneeling, his helmet now resting in the crook of his arm. Confusion flickered across his features as he met the queen's piercing stare, though he masked it quickly with the stoic composure expected of his rank. He had no understanding of why his presence had elicited such a reaction, nor did he dare to ask. All he could do was remain still, his muscles taut beneath his armor, waiting for some indication of what was required of him. Yet, even in his disciplined silence, there was an undeniable curiosity burning in his eyes, a spark of humanity that only deepened the unsettling parallels between him and the man the Queen had lost. As the moments stretched into what felt like an eternity, the Queen's breathing steadied, though her expression remained inscrutable. Slowly, she lowered her hand, the one that had removed his helmet, and clasped it tightly with the other. Her knuckles whitened with the effort, betraying the turmoil roiling within her. Memories continued to flood her mind, unbidden and relentless, each one more vivid than the last. She saw her husband smile, heard his voice calling her name, felt the warmth of his touch, all sensations she had buried deep within herself, believing them lost forever. Now, they surged forth with a ferocity that left her reeling, forcing her to confront emotions she had long suppressed. "Leave us," she commanded abruptly, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The sharpness of her tone startled those gathered, snapping them out of their stunned stupor. Without hesitation, the advisors and attendants scrambled to obey, bowing deeply before retreating from the room. The heavy doors closed behind them with a resounding thud, leaving the Queen alone with the guard. For a moment, the emptiness of the chamber seemed to amplify the weight of what had just transpired, the echoes of footsteps fading into an oppressive quiet. The Queen took a step forward, her movements deliberate yet unsteady. She circled the kneeling figure slowly, studying him with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Her eyes traced every line of his face, searching for any trace of the man she had loved, and finding enough similarities to make her heart ache anew. Finally, she stopped in front of him, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is your name?" she asked, the question simple yet laden with meaning. "Kale," he replied, his voice steady despite the uncertainty swirling within him. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before adding, "Your Majesty." She nodded faintly, as if testing the sound of his name against the memories that haunted her. Kale. It was unfamiliar, yet it carried a resonance that stirred something deep within her. She sank back onto the edge of the dais, her regal poise momentarily abandoned as she struggled to reconcile the man before her with the ghost of her past. "You remind me of someone," she said softly, her words tinged with both wonder and sorrow. "Someone I once knew." Kale inclined his head respectfully, though confusion lingered in his gaze. "I am honored, Your Majesty," he responded carefully, choosing his words with precision. "Though I cannot claim to know whom you speak of." The Queen's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. "No, you wouldn't," she murmured, almost to herself. Then, after a pause, she added, "Tell me, Kale, where do you hail from? What world calls you son?" He hesitated, clearly taken aback by the personal nature of her inquiry. Such questions were rarely posed to members of the royal guard, whose identities were often secondary to their duties. Still, he answered truthfully, "I was born on Vera Prime, Your Majesty, a mining colony on the Outer Rim." His tone carried a note of pride, though it was tempered by humility. "My family served in the Imperial fleet for generations." Vera Prime. The name stirred something within her, though she couldn't immediately place why. Perhaps it was the remoteness of the colony, its isolation mirroring the loneliness she had endured since her husband's death. Or perhaps it was simply the way Kale spoke of it, with reverence and longing, that resonated with her own fractured sense of home. She leaned forward slightly, her interest piqued. "And how did you come to serve here, in my guard?" Kale's expression softened, a flicker of emotion breaking through his disciplined exterior. "It was my father's dream for me to rise above our station, Your Majesty. He believed that serving you would grant me a chance to prove myself, to become more than the sum of my origins." He paused, his voice growing quieter. "He died before he could see it happen. But I carry his hopes with me, always." The sincerity in his words struck a chord within the Queen, stirring memories of her own husband's unwavering belief in her potential. She had been young and uncertain when they first met, unsure of her ability to lead. He had been the one to encourage her, to push her toward greatness even when she doubted herself. Now, hearing Kale speak of his father's faith in him, she found herself drawn to him in ways she couldn't fully articulate. It wasn't just the physical resemblance, it was the spirit behind it, the determination and loyalty that reminded her so achingly of the man she had lost. "You honor your father well," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "And you shall honor mine as well." With that, she rose to her feet, her regal bearing returning as she straightened her spine. "From this day forward, you will serve not merely as a guard, but as my personal attendant. You will accompany me wherever I go, and you will answer only to me. Do you understand?" Cale blinked, clearly surprised by the sudden elevation in status. "Yes, your majesty," he replied, bowing deeply. "I am grateful for your trust." The queen nodded, though her expression remained distant, as if she were already contemplating the implications of her decision. As Cale rose to his feet, she turned away from him, her gaze drifting toward the glowing ceiling above. The light danced across her face, casting shadows that mirrored the conflict within her. On one hand, she recognized the danger of allowing this man, this stranger who bore the face of her past, to grow closer to her. Yet, on the other hand, she couldn't deny the pull he exerted, the way he awakened emotions she had long buried. Whether it was folly or fate, she did not yet know. But one thing was certain: her life, and perhaps the fate of her empire, would never be the same. In the days that followed, the queen's decision to elevate Cale to the role of her personal attendant sent ripples through the palace, sparking whispers and speculation among the courtiers and guards alike. While some viewed his promotion as a testament to his skill and dedication, others saw it as an act of favoritism, fueled by motives they could only guess at. The queen, however, paid no heed to the murmurs. She moved through the halls of her palace with an air of detached resolve, her focus fixed firmly on the task of integrating Cale into her inner circle. Each morning, he appeared at her side, his presence becoming as constant as the shifting light of the bioluminescent ceiling. Together, they navigated the labyrinthine corridors of power, attending councils, overseeing ceremonies, and addressing the myriad demands of an empire that spanned galaxies. Yet, beneath the surface of their professional interactions lay an undercurrent of tension, one that neither could fully articulate. For the queen, every encounter with Cale was a delicate balancing act, a struggle to maintain the aloof authority expected of her while grappling with the emotions he unwittingly stirred within her. She found herself stealing glances at him during meetings, noting the way his jawline mirrored her husband's, or how his laughter echoed faintly of a sound she had thought lost forever. These moments were fleeting but potent, each one chipping away at the walls she had built around her heart. At night, when the palace grew quiet and the weight of her solitude pressed down upon her, she would lie awake, replaying their conversations in her mind, searching for meaning in the smallest gestures or turns of phrase. Cale, for his part, was equally unsettled, though he concealed it with practiced ease. He had always prided himself on his discipline, on his ability to remain steadfast in the face of adversity. But the queen's scrutiny unnerved him, her piercing gaze seeming to strip away layers of his carefully constructed exterior. He sensed that she saw more than she let on, that there was a depth to her perception that left him feeling exposed. And yet, there was also a kindness in her demeanor, a vulnerability that belied her reputation as an unyielding ruler. It was this duality that intrigued him, drawing him closer even as it filled him with trepidation. He began to notice small details about her, the way her fingers twitched when she was deep in thought, the faint crease between her brows when she was troubled, and found himself wanting to understand her better, to uncover the person hidden behind the mask of sovereignty. Their shared experiences only deepened the connection forming between them, though neither dared to acknowledge it outright. During a diplomatic mission to a distant planet, they found themselves stranded in a violent storm, forced to take refuge in an ancient temple carved into the mountainside. As lightning illuminated the cavernous space, casting jagged shadows across the walls, they huddled together for warmth, their conversation turning unexpectedly intimate. The queen spoke of her childhood, of the dreams she had once harbored before duty claimed her. Cale, emboldened by the raw honesty of the moment, shared stories of his own upbringing, of the sacrifices his family had made to ensure his future. For a brief time, the barriers between them dissolved, leaving two souls connected by shared vulnerability. But as the storm subsided and they emerged into the light of a new day, the weight of their roles returned, pulling them back into the rigid framework of protocol and expectation. The queen resumed her commanding presence, issuing orders with precision, while Cale retreated into the disciplined silence expected of him. Still, the memory of that night lingered, a fragile thread binding them together even as they moved through their separate worlds. Back at the palace, the queen found herself increasingly reliant on Cale's counsel, seeking his input on matters both trivial and significant. His insights were sharp and thoughtful, often revealing perspectives she had overlooked. Yet, it was not his intellect alone that drew her to him. It was the quiet strength he exuded, the unwavering loyalty that reminded her so poignantly of her husband. She began to assign him tasks that kept him close, inventing reasons to call upon him throughout the day. Whether it was delivering scrolls to her chambers or accompanying her on solitary walks through the palace gardens, she ensured that their paths crossed frequently. These moments became a lifeline for her, a reprieve from the crushing weight of her responsibilities. In Cale's company, she felt a semblance of peace, a reminder of what it meant to simply exist without the burden of command. Yet, with each passing day, the lines between duty and desire blurred further, complicating the fragile equilibrium they had established. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, allowing herself to grow attached to someone who bore the face of her past. But she also knew she could not stop, not when he offered her a glimpse of something she had long believed irretrievably lost. For Cale, the situation was no less fraught. He admired the queen, respected her strength and wisdom, but he also felt the weight of her expectations pressing down upon him. He understood that his resemblance to her late husband was both a blessing and a curse, a connection that granted him unprecedented access to her inner world while simultaneously casting a shadow over their relationship. He wrestled with guilt, wondering if his presence was a disservice to her, a cruel twist of fate that reopened wounds she had worked so hard to heal. Yet, he couldn't deny the bond forming between them, a mutual understanding that transcended words and roles. As weeks turned into months, their dynamic evolved, becoming a delicate dance of proximity and restraint. They moved through the palace like two magnets, drawn inexorably toward each other yet careful not to cross the invisible line that separated ruler from subject. The courtiers watched with growing unease, their whispers growing louder as they speculated about the nature of the queen's attachment to her attendant. Some warned of the dangers of such entanglements, citing historical precedents where rulers had faltered under the sway of emotion. Others marveled at the transformation they witnessed in the queen, noting the subtle softening of her demeanor, the rare smiles that graced her lips when Cale was near. Through it all, the queen and Cale remained acutely aware of the precariousness of their situation. They were bound by duty and circumstance, tethered to roles that left little room for personal freedom. Yet, in the quiet moments they shared, in the stolen glances, the lingering touches, the unspoken words, they found solace, a fleeting escape from the burdens of their respective lives. It was a fragile alliance, built on a foundation of memory and longing, but it was enough, for now, to sustain them both. The tension simmering between the queen and Cale reached a crescendo one fateful evening, when the palace hosted a grand gala to celebrate the signing of a pivotal treaty with a neighboring star system. The event was a dazzling display of opulence, with crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across the ballroom and orchestral music filling the air with an ethereal melody. Nobles and dignitaries from across the empire mingled beneath the glittering dome, their laughter and chatter creating a symphony of diplomacy and intrigue. The queen presided over the festivities with her usual grace, her regal presence commanding attention as she moved among her guests. Yet, despite the outward appearance of calm, her mind was a tempest of conflicting emotions, each wave crashing against the fragile barrier she had erected around her heart. Cale stood at the edge of the crowd, his armor polished to a mirror-like sheen, his posture rigid as he scanned the room for any sign of trouble. Though his role as the queen's personal attendant afforded him a position of prominence, he remained apart from the revelry, his discomfort evident in the way his fingers drummed lightly against the hilt of his ceremonial sword. He watched the queen from a distance, marveling at how effortlessly she navigated the sea of admirers and sycophants. Her smile was radiant, her words eloquent, yet he could see the strain in her eyes, the same weariness that had haunted her since the day he first knelt before her throne. As the evening wore on, the queen excused herself from a group of dignitaries and made her way toward the balcony overlooking the palace gardens. The cool night air offered a welcome reprieve from the stifling heat of the ballroom, and she stepped outside, her gown trailing behind her like a comet's tail. She leaned against the railing, gazing up at the stars scattered across the velvet sky. For a moment, she allowed herself to forget the weight of her crown, letting the serenity of the cosmos wash over her. But the peace was short-lived, shattered by the sound of approaching footsteps. Cale appeared beside her, his expression guarded yet concerned. "Your Majesty," he began hesitantly, "is everything all right?" The queen turned to him, her eyes reflecting the distant light of the stars. "Do I seem troubled?" she asked, her tone lighter than it should have been given the gravity of her thoughts. "No," Cale replied quickly, though his voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. "But I thought, perhaps you might wish for some fresh air." She smiled faintly, the gesture tinged with both amusement and sadness. "You've always been observant, Cale. Too observant, perhaps." His brow furrowed, and he glanced away, unsure how to respond. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken words. Finally he spoke, his voice low and earnest. "If there's anything troubling you, Your Majesty, I hope you know you can confide in me." The Queen's breath hitched, and she turned fully toward him, her gaze searching his face. "Can I?" she asked softly, her words laced with doubt. "Or would doing so only complicate matters further?" Cale hesitated, his throat tightening as he struggled to find the right response. "Complications are inevitable," he admitted. "But sometimes, facing them is the only way forward." Her lips parted, as if she intended to reply, but no words came. Instead, she reached out, her hand brushing against his arm. The contact was fleeting, yet it sent a jolt through both of them, a spark of electricity that neither could ignore. Cale stiffened, his eyes widening slightly, but he did not pull away. The Queen, too, seemed frozen, her fingers lingering on his sleeve as if reluctant to break the connection. Before either could speak, the sound of raised voices erupted from inside the ballroom, shattering the fragile moment. They exchanged a glance, their shared vulnerability giving way to the urgency of duty. Without a word, they hurried back inside, where chaos had begun to unfold. A delegation from one of the Empire's rival factions had grown agitated, their leader shouting accusations of betrayal and deceit. The Queen's advisors scrambled to defuse the situation, but the tension in the room was palpable, threatening to boil over into violence. The Queen stepped forward, her presence commanding immediate attention. "Enough," she declared, her voice ringing out with authority. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. She addressed the leader of the delegation directly, her tone firm yet measured. "Your grievances will be heard, but not here, not now. If you wish to speak, we will convene privately. Otherwise, leave my palace." The man hesitated, his anger warring with the realization that he had overstepped. After a tense moment, he nodded curtly and gestured for his followers to retreat. As they exited the ballroom, the Queen turned to her advisors, issuing rapid-fire instructions to ensure the remainder of the evening proceeded smoothly. Cale remained at her side, his protective instincts heightened as he scanned the crowd for any lingering threats. Once the immediate crisis had been averted, the Queen dismissed herself, claiming fatigue as an excuse to retire early. Cale accompanied her to her chambers, his steps quick and purposeful as they traversed the dimly lit corridors. When they reached her door, she paused, her hand resting on the ornate handle. For a moment, she simply stood there, her back to him, her shoulders rising and falling with each measured breath. "Cale," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "Stay." He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "Your Majesty," he began, but she cut him off. "Please," she whispered, turning to face him. Her eyes were luminous in the soft glow of the corridor's lights, filled with a mixture of desperation and resolve. "Just stay." Cale swallowed hard, the weight of her request pressing down upon him. He nodded slowly, following her into the chamber as the door clicked shut behind them. Inside, the air was heavy with unspoken truths, the kind that could either bind two souls together or tear them apart. The Queen moved to the window, her gaze fixed on the distant stars once more. Cale stood a few paces behind her, his mind racing as he wrestled with the implications of what had just transpired. Neither spoke for a long while, the silence between them charged with possibility. Finally, the Queen turned to him, her expression a mixture of vulnerability and determination. "I cannot keep pretending," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Not with you." Cale took a step closer, his own defenses crumbling under the weight of her confession. "Nor can I," he admitted, his words barely above a whisper. "But what does that mean for us?" The Queen shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "I don't know," she confessed. "All I know is that I can't lose you. Not again." With that, she closed the distance between them, her hands reaching for his face. Their lips met in a kiss that was both tender and desperate, a collision of past and present, of duty and desire. In that moment, the boundaries that had defined their lives dissolved, leaving only the raw, unfiltered truth of their connection. Yet, even as they clung to each other, the specter of uncertainty loomed large, a reminder that their choices would ripple far beyond the confines of the chamber.